Welcome to Amateur Hour CX, a podcast on the state of cycling from our point of view in the grassroots ranks. Or pretty much whatever strikes Eric's fancy based on who he could trick to come on the show today. I'm Mark Walling, and here's your host, Eric Schillinger.
We're here with Scott Birdsey and Mark Walling.
Yo.
Hi.
And this week's guest, who is a long-time friend of mine and longtime racer, Nathaniel Ward. Hi, Nathaniel.
Hi there.
So Nathaniel grew up in the Capital District of New York State and cut his teeth racing in upstate New York. And then, how many years ago did he move?
I moved to North Carolina in August of 2010.
And you've been racing pretty much all along until how long? How long ago?
I mean, I didn't quit. So quitting is like how do you call it?
Wait, hold on. Maybe we should start with starting, right? When did you start racing?
Well, no, I feel the need to clarify that I feel like quitting is a deliberate act, and I haven't so much quit as like suspended active pursuit of.
So you were suspended active pursuit of bicycle racing.
Yeah.
When did you start active pursuit of bicycle racing? Do you remember? I
do. I remembered. I did my first bicycle racing race. It doesn't seem like that long ago. I feel like I'm not nearly OG enough to be talking about bikes on the internet. 2005, March of 2005, I started riding the bikes with purpose in the summer of 2004 because I was a fat, committed cigarette smoker. I worked at smoking cigarettes. I was good at it. And and I was tubby. And I got tired of those things. And I was watching the Tour de France, as we do. And I was not so much inspired by Lance. I was pretty much inspired by Jan Ullrich because there was something about the guy who's like a few pounds overweight and almost as good as the best guy and just really trying hard that I really identified with that guy. I was like recently, you guys probably read. So Joe Benna, right? Most legendary wrestling coach in New York State history, the mighty Joe Benna, was my best friend's dad. And he just passed away. Rest his soul.
I did read that.
This past week.
That's too bad.
There was a big article in the Schenectady Gazette. So when I was a kid, Joe Benna's youngest son, Mike, was my best friend. Well, Mike has two older brothers, both of whom were state wrestling champions. And so pretty much how tournaments went was like I'd wrestle three guys, I'd beat them, then I'd see Mike and be like, hey, buddy, high five. He'd pin me, and then we'd go to Friendly's and get ice cream. And that's pretty much how that went. And so I always felt like I was bad at winning because, like, I'm a younger brother, and then my best friend was better than me at our sport. So I was just kind of like, yeah, I'll be good enough to hang, but, like, it's cool. Somebody else is going to win. That's not really my thing. And so I spent like many, many years on doing that psychology.
Do you remember, I don't know if it was literally the first time we went riding together or anything like that, but do you remember the first time we went to Challenge Tuesday? Maybe we should tell the internet what Challenge Tuesday is.
Oh, yeah. No, for sure.
Challenge Tuesday, may it rest in peace. What was Challenge Tuesday?
So Tuesday nights in Selkirk, South Bethlehem, New York, outside of Albany, down around the CSX rail yard, there was a nice 5-mile loop that included a decent little climb. It was like a steep kicker that went up past the old town dump.
a lovely vantage point.
This is the nadir.
Rupert Road, baby.
This is the nadir of bicycle racing. And then, it was just like kind of a gradual big ring hill. And then you go up that, and then you got like a pretty good recovery on a downhill section. And it was flat for the run into that sprint has to be like 2 miles or something ridiculous.
Yeah, it's flat for a long time.
It's a long, flat road. So it was a perfect.
And basically straight.
Basically straight. Not a lot of houses because of the dump and the railroad tracks. So, like, given the proximity, I mean, I used to ride there in 28 minutes from my apartment in downtown Albany. So given the proximity to town, it was like surprisingly clutch. And there had been training races going on there since time out of mind. I mean, I don't know, the 70s, like long time. People have been doing.
The only thing I know about I know it's gone back since the very, very beginning of, bike racing culture sort of starting in this area. But I know that they moved it at one point because they had to move it further out of town as development was starting.
But yeah, so Challenge Tuesdays was all right turns like a training race should be, and it's relatively low traffic, and there was an arbitrary sprint point. And so when I started doing it, it was typically A group, B group. The A group would do some race, either a 4-lap race,
some format of races that would be a bunch of laps.
Sometimes two 2-lap races, sometimes a 4-lap race. The B group always did stuff that didn't make any particular amount of sense to me. but was fun nonetheless. And there was good.
Does it make sense to you now, or does it still seem ridiculous?
No, it still seems ridiculous. This like the spiritual leadership was good, but the thing that I never could dig was like you had a bunch of people who were not strong enough to do the A race, like self-selected. They're like, no, we're not doing that. So what they would do was they would soft pedal the climb, and then they would hammer the flat section to the sprint. And I always thought like, hey guys, we're not good at hills, so I kind of feel like on the training ride, I think we should probably try the hills hard. But that wasn't going to fly with the graybeards. And and then we graduated and started to do the A ride. And
so it's interesting that you don't realize what it was for, considering that you know a lot more about bike racing than I do now. It was so that the new people could learn how to ride in a group and learn how to do a sprint with other people around them. Otherwise,
okay, no, that part. Let me
otherwise,
say,
you would all be dropped. If we all just did the hill as hard as we could, then some of us would be at the front and some of us would be at the back. And we already know that. You could go on any group ride and find out that you're the slowest guy up the hill when you're a new rider. The whole point was that despite being not fast, that you would get some experience and keep regrouping on the hill, so you get experience riding in a group and having Gary Topp yell at you about how to do a pace line in the lead out. And then once you learned how to do those skills, you could translate that to hanging in that A group ride longer and longer every race or every week until eventually you made it to the front, and eventually you could attack on the hill, you know?
No, that's what we share. We're of the same religion. Like I believe in these things that you're preaching, but some variety in that format could be good because like immediately.
Right, you could have had a race to the top of the hill one week and a race on the flat.
We've only been talking for 5 minutes, and already we come up against the fragility of masters racers and their unwillingness to do things at which they can fail. Because I think that in a format like that, it's good to try all the stuff that you're not good at. But yes, for sure, being able to dial in, like, how does a lead out work? How do you handle a sprint at speed? How do you position safely and don't cross the yellow line, and being able to do all that stuff. Yeah, I just sort of feel like if I was running one of those, now if I ran the zoo, and occasionally I do run the zoo, there's a 10K loop near my house here in Louisville, North Carolina, that we do laps on, and we tend to regroup. Like we crush the hill and then we regroup, and there's like enough. There's enough racing on a 5 to 6 mile loop that you can like regroup every lap, and you can do like, you can crush the hill, you can do a town line sprint, you can do a pace line, and there's still room to, I mean, it's not whatever, like we're arguing about the policy of a ride that hasn't existed in many years at this point. But so, yeah, it was a training race.
It still exists.
Yeah, it still exists. It's just not in, it's mostly just the B field now. It, like the way you described the B field of let's hammer on the flat and then just slow pedal up the climb is basically what it's been ever.
Oh yeah. No, like I have a very, and I wrote about this too when I wrote, and I could dig it up through the Wayback Machine, but when I wrote the article Underground Legends and Tuesday Night Heroes for Embarkation a bunch of years ago, and I did the interview with Andy Ruiz around the same time, I have a very distinct memory of the tattoo that's on Andy's calf, like in front of me going up the big, like right about where the climb crests by the quarry. And just, it was for real. It was like I'm in a bike race. Like this is legit. Like we're going hard. And I still remember that feeling, and like the light, it's a really vivid memory. It's a visceral thing. Like I remember what the shadows are like on that road in the evening.
You told me at one point that you went harder in that Tuesday night training race than you ever went anywhere else in your life.
I think I'll stick to that. Yeah, that's probably true.
Yeah, I agree 100%, because it's zero consequence. You know, you're racing a real race and you're thinking about a result, and, you know, you have to meter that a little bit to make sure you don't just kill yourself. But there, you could just decide to,
I would say,
see what works.
I'll qualify that only a little bit, in that we have sanctioned Tuesday night races here in Winston-Salem. There's the Dixie, the legendary Dixie, which is a flat quarter-mile car racing track at the Dixie Classic Fairgrounds in Winston-Salem. Shout out 336. And Dixie is a kind of magical place. Like you can pedal every turn, but maybe not if you're on long cranks. John Hamlin, who, if you've been around New England for a long time, John Hamlin at one time walked on water. He was far and away like one of the top bike racers in the country. Whatever came up in the doping era, was always clean. always outspoken, made it hard for him to succeed on big teams. So he had a long pro career, then he had an even longer kind of quasi pro amateur career. And now he's like 43 and rides the trainer and has a million kids, and he can still pedal turns at 40 miles an hour, a few laps at a time. And so Johnny's always out at Winston-Salem, and like, I will say, like, so yeah, the Tuesday night race outside of Albany, like as a Cat 4 newcomer, was the hardest I'd ever gone in my life, probably until I got to the training races here in Winston, because it's kind of the same thing. You're paying an entry fee and it's sanctioned and the results go on the internet, but it's still a training race and there's low consequences. So like, it's a good place to be like, what happens if I feel like I'm going to puke for 10 minutes? Like, can I stay in the bike race? And that's important. You have to have, proving grounds to do stuff like that. But yeah, anyway, Challenge Tuesday is where we learned to race bikes. We went to the first Challenge Tuesday. You, me, and my buddy Jamie, who rode bikes for a while, Jamie Werner, who we got into riding. He had been into riding. I got into riding. He is now an Olympic style weightlifter. I don't know if you've seen Jamie recently. My man is large.
Yeah, he doesn't look like he ever rode bikes ever.
He's no longer a climber.
Like, no, he looks like he would just he looks like he belongs, in the Olympics lifting weights 100%.
So like the Challenge Tuesday training race, we go, and Jamie was riding bikes at that point. So it was you and me. Jamie probably would have been Peter Vidable. That probably would have been our.
Yeah, that was the original OG. Our bike racer.
Yeah,
people.
Man, we're doing this. Well, you guys were the fast guys, because when I got into riding, when I still had like Jesus hair and weighed like 230 pounds.
That's true. I had that was 2005. So I had literally half of one season of racing under my belt compared to you. But I remember you thought that I knew a lot about racing, and that
you were a Cat 4 though. That was legendary. Like you were, because like when you get into something, what do? Like you Google about it. So Cat 4 used to have a newsletter but this was like before people were blogging, and the newsletter was maintained by Tim Hunick. Tim, who's a really accomplished Nordic skier and has raced bikes for a long, long time. I don't think he races anymore. He was a friend of Chuck's, lives out in Fisher's Ferry. He's probably in his 60s now.
Yeah, he doesn't. Yeah, he hasn't raced in a long time.
But so Tim used to edit a newsletter in digital
for CBRC.
For CBRC. And so I stumbled across this online, and I wish I could find it now. I loved it. They would write articles about the Tuesday night race, like with a race report.
Yeah.
It was fantastic. And so I was all in it. I mean, you know me, like I read constantly, and I'm like, I research and I dig in. And so like I knew sort of who the local names were, because I had read those. Like, oh, this is the CBRC crew. So I met you, and it was like,
I mean, it's a very, very early version of cross results,
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's a super analog, like Stone Age cross results. And so, yeah, you were the Cat 4 guy I knew who had like done bike races. So that was, as far as I was concerned, I mean, you were legendary.
And this goes, I didn't know the story about your experience wrestling. This goes perfectly with that. Now, you said to me as we were sort of winding up one of these practice sprints, one of them, maybe the first or second one we were doing, you said, well, here, Eric, you get on my wheel and I'll lead you out.
Yeah.
And that seemed like that made entirely logical sense given the
new guy.
The new guy situation. And when we came around the corner and it was time for everyone to stand up and sprint, you just blew everyone's doors off and finished the sprint. I mean, seriously 50 meters in front of everybody else.
Yeah.
In a distance that was like a 200 meters sprint.
Yeah, that was fun.
And right off the bat, we said, maybe next time around I'll lead you out, or maybe you don't even need a lead out. Maybe you just have to sprint against the rest of us.
Yeah, it's weird. Like my life as a sprinter is weird. Like when I had a really good sprint, I was terrible at positioning. Like I was not a good bike rider. And then I became a good bike rider, and I pretty deliberately gave away a lot of the top end of my sprint trying to build my engine, because I felt like I'd rather finish in smaller groups. Like I'd rather finish in more selective races. And if I lost a little speed, then like, okay. So it's pretty deliberate. So like in recent years, if I win a field sprint, I peak at like 1150 or 1200 watt. Like I don't have a big sprint anymore, but I have a long sprint and I can position myself well. But yeah, when I was new, like out of the box, I had like pretty decent peak power, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was just like, stand up and try hard. Okay.
Right.
And yeah, but it's kind of funny because I spent a lot of my time, I won a bunch of field sprints as a Cat 3 and some as a Cat 4, but I spent a whole lot of time like being the fastest guy to go from like 25th to 8th, because I just couldn't be in the same place. Like I couldn't choose where to be in the field. I'd be where I wanted to be in the field, and then stuff would happen and I would no longer be where I wanted to be, and I didn't know why, and it felt really unfair. And I remember being really frustrated a lot of the time. So yeah, that was my life as a sprinter.
Do you remember? So you started out life as a road racer, because everybody starts out life as a road racer at this point, I think, right? It's the major U.S. Postal. Lance Armstrong is winning the Tour de France like it's a guarantee every year. It turns out it probably was a guarantee every year. Now that we know what we know, and everyone's a road racer. And then somewhere along the line, you got the idea that you should do cyclocross, right?
Pretty early on, yeah, because it was just kind of the done thing. I think I remember even the fall, because I started riding bikes in 2004, and I rode for a year-ish before I started to race. And I remember like being in the bike shops, or in the fall, and like guys were coming in to get tubulars, and I got that it was a thing. And certainly coming up in the Northeast, it's the thing. And also I should probably mention too, like, so my brother went to Hampshire College and has lived in Northampton, Massachusetts for over 20 years now. And so I was plugged into the New England scene, and I got plugged in very early on with Joe May of Joe's Garage in Haydenville, Massachusetts, which, little plug for Joe, by the way, it's the best little bike shop probably in the country. As far as I'm concerned, Joe's awesome. He's like the best wrench you'll find. He's a super accomplished bike fitter, and he's an awesome dude. And as luck would have it, I was interested in buying an independent fabrications bike. I just got into them and their culture of their brand and stuff back then. And so my brother knew a guy who was like a coach and random Cat 3 dude, and worked with him at the Northampton Athletic Club in Massachusetts. And he was like, "Oh yeah, I got a guy. Like, don't go to a bike shop. I got a guy." And I was like, "Oh, you got a guy? All right." So I like made an appointment to like go out to Northampton, and I go to this dude's house, and it's like, literally, it was a garage that was like stripped down to the studs. And I went out with Jamie, actually, with Weightlifting Jamie, to get fit. And so we went through like a whole fit kit thing, and he measured me up for my frame, and it was awesome. Like, he hadn't even hung drywall in the shop yet. And what's awesome about that is Joe's shop has been booming for a long time. He's got a trainer studio now. He's like employed and sponsored a range of guys from Stephen Hyde to Justin Lindeen to Jerome Townsend to a couple of the Gogans to I don't even know who, the Bike Reg Road Team for a while. Like, Joe's turned it into like it's a real big thing. It's a real big thing. But early on, but before he had a shop, he had a garage, and I was one of his first clients, one of his first customers, and we hit it off. We got to be friends. And so whenever I would go out and see my brother and his friends and stuff over there, do whatever I was doing, I would stop by the shop. So eventually I wound up riding for him when he started a team. Like, I guess that would have been a couple years later, 2006, 2007. And so I think the first rider he ever sponsored was Al Donahue. And then the next year it was me and Al were the... Man, that's I forget about that. I know that you know Al, and I know you all rode together, but I forget about the fact that Al, who is now sort of like this crown prince of cyclocross coaching, and it was you and him on that first team, wasn't it? Yeah. I mean, Al, obviously, like... Maybe not literally the first team. Al is also the first person to ever win a cyclocross race I promoted. There you go. He raced the first Schenectady ridiculous cyclocross race, and was the only dude who showed up who was even remotely fast, and I don't know, lapped everybody twice or something, and took $300 and left. He was probably 25 and looking for the $300. Those races, when that happens, it's such an interesting feeling. Like, it's mixed emotions. You kind of feel dirty, but you kind of also feel really happy. Those like small central New York races where you're looking at the promoter, you're like, "Where's the punchline? Are you going to follow me to my car?" Yeah, right. So all right. So you are racing road bikes, and it's your first season of road racing, and you know about this sort of scene that's growing in New England, or is in New England, really. It's established in New England at this point, and you're in this little kind of capital district growing scene, but it hasn't grown yet. Like, the seed of it is planted, and you decide you're going to do cyclocross, right? Yeah. Do you remember, I think it was the first cyclocross race that you went to. It was the first one that we went to together. Do you remember doing this with me? That's right. I forgot that you and I went to that race together. Yeah, absolutely. I remember very clearly. It was up in something Falls, Mass. It's up off of Route 2. It was the only time I ever did it. I don't know if it continued to happen many years after that. But like, I remember one year going and having the elite race canceled it was like me and Al and Toby Marzot were the only people that showed up to the elite race, and they punted and were going to put us with the masters. And so like Al and I went home. I think Toby actually did the race, but it's up off of Route 2, like near where Farley Ledge is and rock climbing terms, like sort of around Greenfield area, but like a little further east. Anyway, but it was cool. It was like a pine forest. It was just a random stop on a road. There was no park. There was no infrastructure. There were no facilities. It was just
it was a complete in the woods. It could have been a mountain bike race, but it wasn't.
Was it a race tape? Did they even have race tape?
They didn't really need it because it was a lot of it was single track.
It was just like trails and sort of double tracky, not like really mountain bike trail, but just trail.
It was like double track fire roads. It's like a pine forest, very much like the Pine Bush in Albany, like similar type terrain, sandy.
Yeah,
trail.
that's a good example. It would be like if you went to the Pine Bush in Albany, most of the trails are very straightforward.
What was punk rock about it was like you follow the directions. Mind you, we were following a road atlas or printed out MapQuest directions. Nobody was looking at their phone.
Yeah.
And you just like got to the side of the road and there was cars parked.
And that was the key. There was a bunch of cars parked on the side of the road, so that was the race.
There was no school. I don't think there was even a tent because it was September. So so we did the race. I did the C race. I won the C race.
But you remember, right? You won the C race, but this was the famous.
I tried to do the B race and I couldn't finish the B race because my wheel came out because I had tried to build up my own cyclocross bike and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And my rear wheel, like I made it all the way through the first race and somehow like 2 laps into the second, my back wheel came loose and like was like loose rubbing into the frame. So that was the end of my first attempt to double up on cyclocross races. We
had the conversation in the car ahead of time in which you said, again, going back to that psychology of, well, I'm with you and you've done this before, so I sort of defer to you. Now, at this point, we knew that you were probably a faster bike rider than me, but we'd somehow rationalized it since I had done cyclocross before and I had some kind of background of mountain biking that you would sort of follow me in this race. And this is back in the Stone Ages before cyclocross categories. So we got to self-categorize. Nobody told us that we belonged in a Cat 5 or a Cat 4 or a Cat 3 race or whatever. You just picked C, B, A, and we said we'll do C, and then I think we were going to do B also. And I remember winning the whole shot in the C race. Probably because neither of us, frankly, belonged in the C race. We were sandbagging, but it was too early in the whole career of doing any of this to know that we didn't belong in a C race.
I don't know. Maybe I'm trying to remember because I remember of who was in the B race. There was a couple of guys. What were their names? Coley.
I have no idea. The fact that you can even recall like any details of this is crazy to me.
They were from Eastern Massachusetts, and they had been racing cross for a long time, and they were guys that used to like do the elite races, and they were doing the B race. So they were there. Matt Purdy had never done any cross, but Purdy was a fine.
Yeah, I remember. Now I forget that Purdy was there too.
Purdy was a fine endurance athlete then and now. I think Willem Heidendahl had been riding bikes a lot at that point. He was still in college, and so I think those guys are like the early Nav crew, and so they were in the B race, and I was like, well. They all had a lot more experience than I did, so
they all appear to have done this before. So the C race, that's how, and that's really how it worked. If people,
I literally built the bike up like I built up a Surly Cross Check like myself, like never built a bike before, put tires on it, and ridden it around the park a couple times. Was like, all right, I'll go do this thing. So whatever, I did the C race. Yeah, it turned out to, I guess.
So we do the C race. I win the whole shot, and the theory is you and I are going to just go as fast as we can, and you're going to follow me as your plan.
Yeah.
I crash in the second turn and you pass me and no one catches you and you win the race.
Yep, sounds right.
Which is perfect, right?
Yeah. I'll take it.
What year are all these races happening? Schenectady and this one?
That would have been 2005. Schenectady started, I think, before I started racing. I remember seeing pictures somewhere of it in the snow. Todd Crisafulli and him put that on first.
So Schenectady there's Schenectady is pretty simple. I think the first cross race in Schenectady was actually in 2002, and Dave Beals organized that, and probably with assistance from Todd or loosely working with Todd. Then he ran that in 2002, 2003, 2004. In 2004, I was working at CK Cycles, and we got the idea that we would put some races on also. And the park in Schenectady at the time was just really willing to let people use it. So we actually did 2 races in Schenectady in 2004. There was a race that Dave put on. It was a CBRC race. And then also a race that we ran through CK Cycles. That's the race that Al came to and won. He probably won the other one too. I don't know. Then we never did 2 in Schenectady again. We got smarter about picking venues. In 2005, we had...
Do you remember that we did the Colony Town Park race that time? And it had like...
Yeah, that was the Colony Town Park. That was the same year we had the Colony Town Park race.
And 2005 was the first year that we did Uncle Sam.
And 05 was the first year we did Uncle Sam. We still had the Colony Town Park race. But then we got kicked out of Colony Town Park that year. They wouldn't let us back after that year because it rained and we destroyed the park.
Right, it rained, we destroyed the park. There was like standing water on the course. I remember.
Where would you even do it in Colony Town Park that wasn't like in the single track?
Yeah, it was basically all on trail and stuff.
There was a lot of grass. It wasn't that mountain bikey. It had a decent run up. I remember Corey Burns, the mighty Corey Burns back in the day, came and beat out.
Beat everybody down real bad.
Anyway, so Uncle Sam started that year. Because I remember walking the course with you and Pete. You're like, yeah, we're going to do this cross race. And so I met you guys out on a Friday afternoon or something. And we were like walking the Uncle Sam course. Like, we could go here, we could go there, we go here, we go there. So there was Central Park, Schenectady. There was Uncle Sam the first year that you did it. And there was the Colony.
And then there was a race in Colony.
And then Bethlehem. That was when Chuck, in 2005 or 2006, when Chuck started.
And I think the next year Chuck added Bethlehem. I'm pretty
I still
sure.
have the original Skull and Crossbones 2006 Bethlehem T-shirt.
06, Chuck was, again, in the stone ages of how things worked. Chuck was able to just ask to promote the state championships, having never promoted the cyclocross race before ever, and they just said, yeah, sure. So that first race, it was just state championships was his idea.
Yeah, I guess so. That's right.
And then it stuck around.
Night cross races, because that was before there was no like Kirkland race. Like Saratoga came later when Bernstein was in Saratoga.
Yeah, then it all grew and it developed from there. Absolutely.
Yeah, so Night Cross was small, which was awesome, by the way, and I still think it's awesome because I love the Verge series and I love the New England scene, and I love a lot of the local races in New England. Like Putney is one of my favorite races and always will be. Cheshire Cross is awesome, but I mean, I figured out really early that like the further east you went, like first to central Massachusetts and then to Boston and then eventually to Belgium, like the further east you get, the better the bike racing goes. And the further west you go, there's like in the mid-Atlantic, it tends to fade. You have to go south or like jump a couple states and kind of get out to like the rest of the country is weird. There's like hotbeds here and there. And then there's these like wide swaths, like, the southern tier of New York and like northern Pennsylvania, where the population density is just not that high and there's not a ton going on. I'm probably like horribly offending people in the Mohawk Valley right now. You go to bike races in central New York and it's awesome. The enthusiasm is there and the people are great and the courses are great. And God knows if you've ever ridden bikes around the Finger Lakes, the terrain is amazing, but there's just not a huge concentration of people. So you tend to get small fields. And so I started immediately to go. I would always support the local races. But I would always race in New England because the scene was just bigger and more established, I guess. But I like, so that long digression is all to say, I think Nightcross feels like a super useful niche because I miss it, because down here there's like one UCI weekend and then sometimes there's a UCI weekend in Tennessee and then there's one in Baltimore, but that's like, Baltimore's like 8 hours from here. DC is like 5 hours from here. So around North Carolina, there's the NCCX, right? And that's the big series. But it's like they're small races in terms of prize money and quality of fields. They're basically Nightcross races-ish. It's grown a little beyond that. But it's like...
What's like the average number of racers showing up at a NCCX race?
Oh, I'll get in trouble if I start throwing around numbers. Let me think. So...
I mean, not to like the decimal point, but is it a couple hundred people? Is it 300 people?
Let me make sweeping generalizations with broad brush strokes, and then I'll poorly defend them later. It's like the big race, small races that are big. Like if it's the only race around, it's a big deal. And so sometimes the vibe, it's like the big state series. And what was nice about Nightcross was like, if you wanted to like get your serious hat on and go race in a field of 80 racers as a Cat 3, you could do that. You can go to Gloucester, you can go to Northampton, you can go to Farmington, Connecticut when they still had the Farmington race, you go to Rhode Island, whatever. And around here, there's only like one race. So like the seriousness of like, this is my field and these are my series points or whatever.
It's a 15 race series with the smallest race being 160, the second smallest being 203.
There you go. So in terms of numbers,
so it's maybe it's like a notch up from the scale of the Nightcross races,
right? Only because there's no alternative. So and where a lot of that where I see the difference in field size is really you go to the elite men's race and there'll be 20 or 25 racers. Sometimes bad weather later in the year it's only 15. Occasionally like Kerry Werner will show up. Tristan Cowie, like Tristan was on the world's team. Tristan's a North Carolina homeboy. he'll show up and race. And obviously when those guys are racing, like, then that's the show. But when they're not around, you know, you get like guys like me who are like in a national sense, like we're not even like a tertiary factor, and we can still podium in those races. So it's like, if I can podium in an NCCX race, I can podium in an iCross race. Like, it's whatever Colin would say about it. As far as I'm concerned, it's samesies.
Right, sure.
And so, but what I dug about Nightcross and still do is that it's like the intensity factor is dialed back a little bit, and it's a little bit more like that's where you get to be friends, like as a promoter or like as a new like Cat 4, Cat 3 racer. That's where you get to be friends with somebody like Al Donahue or like a legendary Masters racer like Mark Stotz or somebody who used to come over and do those races, because it was a much more like everybody hang out in the parking lot and be friends about the thing you're interested in kind of vibe. And the big UCI races still have that vibe. I mean, it's still cyclocross, but it's more serious, and team tents are set up in expo areas and points, and it's a bigger deal. And so I kind of miss that, like having a local grassroots series in close proximity to a UCI series. Like, sure, you guys are lamenting like you're losing entry fees when you go up against a big race 3 hours away, but it's also true that you have a choice of like, I don't want to race 80 guys and be serious. I want to stay home. And like, I was like BMX riding bikes as a kid. You know what I mean? Like, what can we do? Let's run tape around this park and build crazy obstacles. Can you ride? I can't ride it. Can he ride it? You can ride it. Awesome. And that vibe is great. Like, that vibe is, so I don't know. You kind of never want to lose that. And that's what I love Nightcross for, is that you guys like keep that alive, and the quality of the races grows and the quality of the racers grows. I mean, I remember Nightcross races where there was like, you know, 2 or 3 like current or former members of the world's team, like UCI race winners, you know, junior national champions up in the A race. Like one year we had like Matt White, Justin Lindeen, Al Donahue, Will Dugan. You know what I mean? Like the A race at Troy a couple years was legit.
One of the things I wanted to talk with you about, is the idea that we had been sort of bantering back and forth about, looking at what growth in cyclocross looks like and how you could define growth. And you're sort of segueing into it, maybe partially intentionally or maybe not at all, the idea that scale and size of events and also number of events, all of these things have a certain meaning and impact, and maybe there's a way to think about how that affects growth and what growth should look like, versus just always saying growth equals more people through the turnstiles.
Yeah, that's a hard, well, and I got to be careful too, because like I got a lot less skin in the game than people that I know and care about who have been doing this for many, many years longer than I have. So like, it's easy for me to say philosophically that like the pursuit of growth by numbers in cyclocross is just a reflection of our like late capitalist values, and we should focus on quality, not quantity. Like that's a great thing to say, like conceptually, but the fact of the matter is, like, if I'm somebody who's been doing cyclocross since the 80s, and if I'm somebody who's like, you know, helped grow the scene nationally, like you got a stake in seeing it be viable and continue to survive. So that's not lost on me at all. But I will say that I think, and this is true on the road too, like numbers of participants don't raise the ceiling. And so I guess I'm not clear necessarily, because people say all kinds of angry stuff about USA Cycling, which I think is ridiculous. Like USA Cycling is like populated by people who care a lot about bikes and want to make bike stuff more possible and more available. I mean, give them a break. But like, do you want a lot of people racing bikes, or do you want the people who are best at racing bikes to have a fast track, to be like well looked after and get to the best races? And those aren't the same goal. And so I don't know. Like, I certainly don't have an answer, and I don't have much of a background in race promotion. I put on the odd race here or there. I'm a volunteered a ton, but like, I'm not the person to have the insight into like what the answer is, capital letters, to growth in American cross. I will say, I think it's a shame that we've seen an increase in participatory style events and a decrease in competitive events in recent years, like cookie rides and Fondo rides and charity rides.
Yeah, so maybe so we don't necessarily need to assault cyclocross promoters, because everybody who's in the cyclocross game really is all in the same basket. But maybe we can take a look at that first. You've got racing, and the first thing
don't insult triathletes again, please.
You're the one who's bringing it up, not me.
Wait a minute, what are we not assaulting?
Well, if you listen to our first episode, we had a discussion about the participatory nature of triathlon, and how in triathlon everyone is really rewarded, and I shouldn't say everyone literally all the time, but a common.
theme of triathlete bashing, your comments were mild. I heard them, and I feel like
exactly.
we can get that.
In triathlon, there is a element of it that is participatory, that people are congratulated for completing the triathlon. And I think we can all say that we have definitely done races where, for one reason or another, lack of fitness, being too heavy, having a flat tire, list of other reasons, you finished the race, and when you got to the finish, there was literally no one even there. They'd already cleaned up and gone home, right?
Yes.
That doesn't happen in triathlon. In triathlon, you get a pat on the back because you made it.
It's a big deal. Yeah, it's much more like like ultra mountain bike style thing. Like I've done,
That's true.
ORAM, Spike 65, some of the unsanctioned races down here, and you go to do ORAM, and you have Tristan, you have Thomas Turner, like another legendary pro mountain biker, and that's going to be a serious bike race, and you have people in costumes and on fat bikes, and people take 12 hours to do the thing that gets won in 4.5. So I think that vibe does exist. Grand Fondos are another example of that. Especially down here in North Carolina. Like, it took me so many years to figure it out. The criteriums in North Carolina are serious as a heart attack. But the road racing scene, in terms of long, hilly road races, very, very few of them, and they're not popular when they happen. But you have these ridiculous mountainous cookie rides. Like, there's a cookie ride, charity ride to the top of Mount Mitchell. There's a charity ride to the top of Beech Mountain. And there's no prize money. And there's like 800 people, but the front 30 are racing it like it's the World Championships. And I'm like, wait a minute, what? Like, we're going to pay an entry fee, a big one, and we're going to go to the thing. There's no prize money, and it's not sanctioned. But it's going to be like a full-on throwdown, dogfight, bike race. But then there's going to be like 700 people behind me. Do I have this right? And they're like, yes, that's exactly how it works. It took me like 5-6 years living here before I would do one. And then, funnily enough, probably the hardest efforts I've ever made in a bike race have been like unsanctioned North Carolina shit that nobody outside of the state has ever heard of. And go figure.
Which is consistent with how it would work. The unsanctioned thing no one's ever heard of is where you're going to go the hardest. And that's something I can't explain. If you have a scene where you've got the one end of the spectrum, it's and without respect to the specific style of the event, right? So it could frankly be a triathlon, it could be a gravel ride, it could be a Grand Fondo, it could be a cookie ride. It's participatory.
What's a cookie ride? I've never heard of a cookie ride.
Cookie ride's a North Carolina thing. It's like the charity rides, because sometimes where you would put like on down here would be like on pre-reg or something. The prizes, the prize list would be listed as cookies, for everybody. So you say like, what are you doing this weekend? Oh man, I ain't doing that. Just a cookie ride.
That's cool. It's like a sociolinguistics thing. It's like subs versus hoagies versus grinders.
There you go. Yeah, exactly. So that's it. So cookie ride is a thing down here. I'm going to solve this problem though real quick, because we've been talking for a while, but I'm just going to answer it right now. You ready? America's not ready for bicycling to be a mainstream sport. It's not going to happen. It's not a thing. It's not doable. It's bigger than it used to be in CrossFit Games and this and that and stuff and whatever. When it's in the Olympics, maybe people don't have the attention span for it. We just want a gold medal in curling. Like, is there going to be like a huge spike in interest of curling and kids are going to be curling after school next year, like all over California? No, it's just not. Like, we're a stick and ball sports country. And I feel like that's probably not going to change. Bicycling's been around in the United States for a really long time on a pretty large scale, like the Red Zinger Classic and the Tour de Trump and the Tour de Pont and Tour California. Like, there's no shortage of opportunity for American fans to get it. But fundamentally, it doesn't fit with our social hierarchy. Like, the Europeans love bike racing because on Easter flipping Sunday in a Catholic country on Easter Sunday, everybody is on the streets for the Tour of Flanders when it falls on Easter Sunday, or when Paris-Roubaix falls, because it's a religious experience. You can touch the mightiest athletes in the world. It's populist. It's free. It puts your hometown on the map, and like, you and the people that you can relate to are a part of the event. And that's not American. Like, there's nothing American about that. Like, people might enjoy it if they experienced it, but it just doesn't we do hierarchy in stadiums and gated access. Like, that's our.
Right. What's the coolest thing you can do? You can be a guy with season tickets to the Lakers sitting next to Jack Nicholson at $5,000 a seat.
Gated access. That's what's up. Like, that's what we are. And so bike racing doesn't work that way, because, I remember my first experience of bike racing was the Tour de Trump, 1989. I was 12. My dad took us down around New Paltz, and we stood on 44-55 underneath the traps, waiting to watch like Gert-Jan Tunisse and like Ekimov, and my buddy Thomas Craven, who I would meet like later, like after I moved down here. Like my man was like winning the race. He directs the Hollow Esco Hincapie team now, and he's from Winston-Salem. We got to be friends after I moved here, and I was like, wow, that's crazy. I watched you race bikes when I was 12. And I remember standing by the side of the road for hours and was like, what's going to happen? Stuff's going to happen. And there was these like skinny guys with these goofy hats on, wearing like bell bottom jeans and like early Nikes that were like super excited about what was about to happen. And then this like crazy spectacle of noise and wind came by, and you were excited, and then it was over. And we were like, now what? Well, now we get in the car, we go watch him again. And like, all right. And I had like no idea. No conception of like stages and scoring, and there'll be a winner today who's not the overall winner. Like, I didn't know. It was just exciting. It was something to do with my dad and my brother. It was cool. But yeah, it's just not culturally.
Do you think that experience, being exposed to that early, made you ultimately predisposed, when Armstrong rises to fame and ESPN starts to pick up the cycling coverage, to go get a road bike?
Probably. I had ridden bikes. I went to a summer camp in Vermont where we did a lot of touring bike riding, which I enjoyed a lot. I thought it was really cool. I've always loved the freedom. I remember being 7 years old. The first time I had a babysitter who had somewhere she had to go. And she let me ride my bike like a mile to my other babysitter's house because she didn't want to take the time to like bring me. And I remember the freedom of being like 7 years old and going somewhere autonomously. It was amazing. It's an amazing feeling. You can go fast, you can slow down, you can take a detour, you can jump off a curb, you can do whatever. It's just this level of autonomy that's spectacular, and you feel it every time you clip in. It's awesome. It's kind of not like anything else because the bicycle's the most efficient machine in the world, right? Like it can go with almost no effort. And you feel like you're flying, and that's pretty great, and that never gets old. So I love riding bikes, and I had a rigid mongoose at some point in the early 90s. I tried running. I was a rock climber, like pretty avid rock climber for many, many years. So like outdoor sports, like kind of fringe sports, non-team sports was not a new thing for me. But yeah, probably. I mean, I remember watching American Flyers. I love the movie American Flyers before I was ever knew anybody who raced bikes. And my brother like got into touring and did a couple of time trials like in the late 80s, like when Greg LeMond was winning the Tour.
I don't think you ever mentioned that to me. So your brher actually was racing. He's older than you, right? He's
really crazy. He and a buddy had bikes, and they did some touring. Like they did some my brother did like a touring thing where he rode from Seattle to San Francisco, and then he came back and he wanted to race. So my dad had this old like steel British racing bike, and so he went and did the Fisher's Ferry time trial because I grew up in Rexford, like just by the Mohawk River. So he went down to the Fisher's Ferry time trial back in the day, which is funny to think that my brother, like as a high school freshman.
Your brother, as like a 14-year-old junior racer, was doing the Fisher's Ferry time trial.
Right, like Tim Hunick and Andy Ruiz and John Verheul or whoever would have been around. You know what I mean? It's like kind of funny. And then many, many years later, I like enter into that world, and some of those people become my best friends. But
they're back now, by the way.
Yeah, so it wasn't. It wasn't totally off my radar screen, but I didn't know anything about like I didn't know the culture of racing. I was like any American. I knew about the Tour de France and I knew about the Tour de Trump, and I didn't know anything about cycling tactics or cycling teams or
I still don't. Man, that's an issue. I don't just pedal harder than everyone else.
Well, yeah. So anyway, I don't know. Was I disposed to it? I think I was disposed. I mean, I have the disposition of an endurance athlete, which is to say that I struggle with depression. Like I live with depression. I manage it. I have a pretty intense compulsive personality, and when I like to do things, I like to do them well, and I like to do them a lot, and like that's a disposition. Like those factors are pretty common among endurance athletes because fundamentally, like what are you doing? You know what I mean? Like why you want to suffer so much, man? Like what'd you do bad?
Yeah.
Why
No, it's hard, man, because it's as somebody who doesn't really do it anymore from the perspective of a competitive athlete, that's the thing. We were joking. We were talking earlier in the day. Scott and Mark and I were talking a little bit about my basically being over it. They always tell me that I'm just over it. Whenever we're talking about anything with Nycross, I'm always just pretty much like, this is stupid. And I don't really think that, but it's because the level of suffering required to be even modestly competent at this sport is so high. So you got to either be chasing some demons or just have a lot of spare time, you know?
Yeah, or both. I mean, you need a lot of spare time in which to.
Well, yeah, and then that's it. Right. If you don't have the spare time,
Yeah, I
it doesn't
mean-
matter. It doesn't matter,
Yeah.
you know?
Or you go the Mark method, like we talked about earlier before the show started, where you end up being a doer.
That's right.
The doers are really, God bless the doers, man. Because honestly, I mean, it's weird. There's like so you guys were talking, I was taking mental notes. I'm going to try to focus because we've just been off in the field of flowers here, but such is the nature of podcasts among friends. The whole business of, is cycling like a lifestyle culture or is it a sport? So I think the answer is yes. I think it's both. And I think the challenge for American cycling is that there's a conflation of the two. So like my participation in local group rides and local criteriums is a sport to me in that I'm competing, but it has fuck all to do with like the sport writ large, right? Like it's not growing anything. It needs to be there so that when the talented junior comes along, we can say, whoa, talented junior, let's introduce him to people who can, or her, to shuffle that person along to the next stop on the road. So that
Right, sure. If we don't have, 20 to 40 person Nycross fields going around, we don't necessarily ever end up with Curtis White and Emma White, right?
Right. You have to have infrastructure. You have to have a community to plug those people into. And yeah, I mean, shoot, I remember I sold Tom White Curtis's first kit. I was CBRC secretary that year. And I remember meeting him at the Daily Grind in Albany and like selling him Curtis's first CBRC jersey. And now, of course, clubs,
there are people out there who are forces of nature that will do it no matter what. Curtis and Emma may actually be that category. Emma might have been a world champion level cyclist regardless.
Tom runs the rowing program at Union College, right? So like maybe if there's no bike racing around, if they live somewhere where it's not viable, maybe they're Nordic skiers or rowers.
Right.
Like
that's fair. I mean? That's a fair point. Sure.
There has to be some amount of infrastructure and stuff happening on the ground for people to plug into. So in that sense, growth by numbers is like the first step of keeping the sport viable. It has to exist.
I was talking to Andy Ruiz, actually. I shouldn't throw Andy under the bus, but it's hearsay to me. But Andy had told me that the origin story of Curtis being interested in cycling to begin with is that he had watched an old VHS tape of a Tour de France stage or something similar to that he had, that in 2004, 2005, he, as a really young kid, found this tape, started watching it, got really interested in it. And then Tom, there you go. That's how he ends up with you in the Daily Grind. Tom probably finds that CBRC newsletter on the internet, finds out that there's a thing, that there's some responsible people doing cycling, introduces them to Curtis, and there you go,
It's a special kind of commitment as a parent. It's 8:00 on a Thursday night. You live 30 minutes away from the spot where the race is. Like it's kind of a fringe activity. So in that sense, I think it's a lifestyle sport in the sense that to be any good at it, it has to be a daily priority, which is fundamentally unreasonable at a certain level. I mean, there are phases of life in which that makes sense, but throughout most of your life, I don't know, man. Like I sacrificed a lot on the altar of trying to be good at bikes, and it's fine. And it's given me a lot back, and I have a successful coaching business, and I made a lot of friends, and I love the sport, and it's a beautiful thing. I think it's given me a lot as a person, and it's also true that I have to think that like, I like to do a lot of things that are like fundamentally not really beneficial to anybody but me. Like I've played competitive chess, which I love doing, but it's like, it's kind of hard to justify. You know what I mean? Like weekend chess tournaments, the games are 5 hours long. Like you go on Friday afternoon, you don't come back until late Sunday night. Like what grown up can reasonably do that once a month? Like we don't have that kind of slack in our lives as a rule. We ought to probably.
Wait a second. Don't we do that every weekend in September and October, November?
I mean, at least 5 hours.
This is what I'm saying. And so I've had my oldest kid I'm 40 years old. My oldest child is going to turn 20 this year. And so for the entire amount of time that I've been involved in bikes, I've been balancing the responsibilities of a parent. Sometimes I balance them well. Sometimes I haven't balanced them particularly well. And so like, that's the challenge for me is like, there have been seasons where I felt like I got that balance pretty good. And like was able to do well on the bike and acquit my responsibilities as a family man decently. And there've been seasons where, I don't know, I've definitely had the feeling of like accomplishing things on the bike that I didn't think I could accomplish and like not really getting to feel good about it because it came at a cost of being a decent grown up. And I'm comfortable saying that. And I know when I say that, people become uncomfortable and defensive, and that's fine because I'm only talking about me. I'm not talking about other people, but I mean, holler if you hear me, guys. I know I'm not the only one. And so for me, I'm in a place in my life where like I miss racing. I miss that feeling of being in shape and being able to know that I can make my body do tricks that it seems unlikely that it could do, but I'm just not willing to give up all the other stuff that I have in my life right now to make the time for that. So it's kind of like, I've ridden my bike 3 out of the last 4 days for the first time in like 4 or 5 months. It's kind of a big deal.
Yeah, Nathaniel, I saw on your Instagram today a picture of you, and it sounded like you were planning some kind of epic comeback
I'm
for this year.
I'm making fun of myself. I just felt like I just needed to like.
He had the optimism filter turned on his Instagram, is what happened.
I just needed to have people like. I just needed to like remind the world that I'm still actually. I've lost a certain amount of coaching clients, which is funny because I'm like, well, you're paying me to help you be good at racing bikes. You're not paying me so that I'm good at racing bikes. Like I've done that ish, whatever to whatever level of my ability. Like now it's your turn. I still know whatever it is I know that can make me useful as a coach, but so I felt like I needed to demonstrate that I still know how to ride a bike. I can do it without falling over. It's good.
When the Yankees hire a pitching coach, they don't expect him to be the second starter in the rotation also.
Right. So now we're circling back to the whole culture thing, and like yeah, it's a really interesting thing in terms of your visibility or your like effectiveness as a coach or like
if you're a doer in the sport of cycling, you have to actually still be engaged in the participatory aspect of it. When I stopped showing up at group rides on a weekly basis, when I stopped being the guy who was handling every part of some of the cycling culture around here, there was a point where I was the president of CBRC, I was running the Nycross team, I was running the CBRC road team, I was running the series, and I could pretty much send out an email and have 300 people show up to help at any given time, right? As that wore on, and I was less.
I have to say, your hyperbole chops are.
Well, I have a thing hanging on the wall that says I can talk. The recent scenario, although not recent, not most recently, the recent situation of say in the not the last 3 years, but for the 5 years preceding that. The ability to turn out, say, volunteers to help with registration at a cyclocross race was diminishing and diminishing every year for me and for the couple of guys who I was working with closely to run the races. And I ultimately came to the conclusion that I just literally did not have that cultural, familial capital that you need to get people to be on your side to come help. Because if you don't know me from riding a pace line every Tuesday night for 6 months in a row, why are you going to come and help when I say we really need volunteers for the race? And if you don't show up, we can't have the race at all. Do you like doing the race? Well, then come and help, right?
But shouldn't the answer to that be like, because that's what it means to participate as a member of the community. And if you're one of the senior members of that community, like what business is it of mine? Like you're allowed to be fat and have a mustache and smoke cigarettes if you're a baseball coach. You know what I mean? Like that's the point. Like it doesn't matter. You know stuff about stuff and you're planning to do the thing. And like, I don't know. It's that, yeah. So that's a weird thing. You're like viability.
Right. Having not had a coaching business, having no business being a coach, I would never have thought that there was a correlation there. But it doesn't surprise me at all that you say, as I get out of the actual racing scene and I'm not out every night doing a training ride with people start to question my coaching jobs. When I was out of the racing, as soon as I stopped being in the racing scene, I got a distinct downturn in people offering to help when we said we're running a race, we need help. Maybe this should be a message for people. Trust your coach, whether you can beat him in a sprint or not, because what he can teach you is more important than whether he's good. Help the promoter, even if you've never heard from him before, because he probably runs something that you would like to do and participate in it. And it will go away if you don't come and help.
Well, right. And I think so. I think that so like a lot of what people are into, like your experience around bikes, if you're a bike racing person, is like that's your social currency, right? It's how you socialize, it's how you meet people and how you identify yourself. And I mean, that's all positive, by the way. Like people need those things. I think that, particularly men, like I'm a middle school teacher in the age of school shootings right now. So I think a lot about like what it means to raise boys who don't want to shoot people. And like, I think that with all respect to women's racing, which I think is competitively women's racing right now is like far more entertaining than men's racing. And like, I think we're seeing in this country, like the fruits of Title IX, like our female athletes are crushing on the world stage, and we're starting to see like prize money parity, which is awesome and long overdue and all that stuff. So that is true. And what I want to talk about right now is my experience, which is that bike racing is a really healthy and safe, like male bonding activity that's fundamentally positive. I mean, there's like jock behavior in every sport. And I think the further up the ladder you go and the more you're surrounded by people who are really focused on winning, the more intense the jock behavior becomes. But I think that like men in our society need ways to have like Iron John experiences and make fires and find our hairy man. And there's something about the like proximity without intimacy of like riding bikes next to somebody with no eye contact, driving 2 bike races with no eye contact, where like you can have really intense bonding experiences with a peer group, do something together that feels productive, in a way that's like, you know, fundamentally safe and positive, and has some emotional insurance around it too, because that's like, it's really hard to be a guy in this world and be vulnerable and be like, I need friends, I'm lonely. And we're looking for, some men find that at the gun range, some find it at, you know, the driving range shooting golf balls, and some find it at the bar getting drunk. But like fundamentally, I mean, that's what people are looking for, is a place to find belonging and significance, right? So that's what we find through bike racing. And I think that that's really, really good. And that's not necessarily a recipe for producing like super athletes that are going to win the Olympics. So like, I guess you just have to parse out like, what is the role of the governing body in terms of growing the sport as a entertainment product and as a profession. And that doesn't really have anything to do with why we do it because we love to do it, right? Like those are fundamentally pretty different things.
You know, it's such a tiny niche, right? Going off of your thoughts that essentially bike racing is just not made for America, and it's never going to be, or it's not there yet. That's the complexity. The tiny niche is something that simultaneously has to produce world championship level athletes and also satisfy the participatory nature of a beer league softball tournament, right? Yeah. Nobody playing the beer league softball tournament is going to figure that Derek Jeter is going to show up at their race, or at their softball tournament, right? But it's actually completely reasonable to think that current or former national champion level racers could show up at even just a local amateur race, you know?
Yep, that happened to me last year.
Yeah, you showed up at a local race, and Stephen Hyde, the current national champion, just happened to show up there, and then you beat him, right? Didn't he double flat or something? And technically, you're ahead of him in the results.
Oh yeah, no, him, Jeremy Powers, you know, the whole Jam Fun crew all showed up at BCA Cyclocross, which is, you know, super small race. And it was awesome. They hadn't even pre-registered, so they just started at the back of the field, which was just super funny for obvious reasons. And that's the best part of cyclocross, is that you get to have that stuff happen.
Oh, totally. Cycling in general. I mean, that, yeah, absolutely. Like I've had that experience. I've had that experience in road races, like winding up in breakaways with guys and being like, who? You know, like yeah, right. You know, and
oh man, I think it must have been Eric Justaiza, the former CBRC president. He told me one time that he he was at, it must have been like a pre-Philly circuit race or something years ago, when the Philly race was the national championship, and Jens Voigt was there because whatever team Jens was riding for, his trade team, it was when the scene was so small that they still allowed non-U.S. citizens riding on trade teams just to enter the race, because otherwise there would have been like a total of 12 people in the national championship race for American professionals. And same thing, Eric's just riding in a group in some maybe it was even post-race, it might have been before or after, but some race proximate in time to Philly, and he's just in the group in some little criterium going around in the circle, and he looks next to him, and Jens Voigt is riding in the group right next to him. And then just as things start to get serious from Eric's perspective, somebody attacks, starts going fast, Jens reaches in his back pocket and he takes out something wrapped in a paper towel, and you're like, what's it going to be? And Eric's now watching him, even though we should be watching the race, and he watches Jens Voigt actually unwrap a piece of birthday cake and then eat it very comfortably, as, you know, the Cat 1s and Cat 2s at the front of the criterium are launching attacks, and he's just breathing through his nose, eating birthday cake, and then went on eventually to ride away from the field.
I remember Eric telling the birthday cake story, but I didn't remember that it was about Jens. That's really funny. But yeah, no, that's one of the like the democracy, lowercase d, of of bike racing is one of the things I love about it. I mean, I've definitely one of the better results I ever got in my life was the Bound Brook Crit in New Jersey, Somerville weekend. Like I made the break, like I was in the race with Matt Purdy, and Matt Purdy made an attack, and it was a legit race. There's the Team Type 1 was there. They had a whole full field, and there were guys from Ouch Maxis there after HealthNet, before United Healthcare, that team. I think Bobby Lee was in the race, a bunch of guys from the Jameis team. Like it was a legit Pro-Am field the day before Somerville. It started to rain. Purdy had made an attack. He got pulled back. Fields lined out, going fast, and there was a couple of tight corners. And so I was like, all right, teammate came back, coming into a chicane, done, like attack through the corners. And I got clear, and two guys came with me, and one of them was from Type 1. And I was like, sweet, he's got like 9 teammates here. They're going to shut it down, and we're going to be good. And we were. And he ripped my legs off, and it was horrible. But it was Matt Wilson. He had been on Cofidis. He was Australian national champion. He'd ridden the tour. He was on Cofidis, and then he got busted down to farm team and was on like a D2 team for a couple of years, racing Type 1, and he was over here doing the Criterium. And the following year, he was back on Garmin riding the tour. And I got to ride in a breakaway with the guy and like go to the line. It was awesome. Like you can't, awesome. You can't have that experience in another sport. Like you don't really get to have that experience as a I don't even know what the equivalent is. Like, strangely enough, learning more about NASCAR culture living in the South, I think actually in NASCAR, you kind of can, like Tony Stewart will show up and like murder somebody at the local flat track. Oh, NASCAR jokes. I got it all, baby.
I think you're actually, you said something to me. We were talking the other day about how racing sports are ultimately the ultimate sport because of that, because you have this raw distillation of the competition in every event. There's never a blowout. There's never a scenario where there's always a moment where the break goes. There's always a moment where the sprint happens. In an auto race, it's very analogous. I could see how that could absolutely happen. I'm sure that Jeff Gordon or Tony Stewart or any of those guys probably do show up at the flat track and let her rip every once in a while, and everybody's like, "Oh snap!"
There's an F1 go-kart track in Mooresville that I've been to. It was John Hamlin's 40th birthday party. Was like 20 Cat 1 and ex-pro bike racers like racing each other in go-karts at 50 miles an hour, which was every bit as intense as you can imagine. And by the way, John Hamlin's as good of a go-kart driver as he is bike racer. But that track has there's a night where all the NASCAR guys come and race go-karts against each other. It's like a local club thing. And all the NASCAR guys ride bikes around here. I know a lot of dudes that are involved in NASCAR at high levels of the sport living in North Carolina, and most of them ride bikes to train and stay in shape.
Yeah, for fitness, right?
Racing sports,
obviously for fitness.
Racing sports for me, it's the cool thing about racing sports is that we're making our best effort at the same time, and one of our best efforts is better, and one of us is willing to endure a little more, and that's really cool. Because I think in a lot of sports, you're not necessarily if you're the shortstop, your effort doesn't necessarily match up with the batter's effort or whatever. I'm trying to think of what's analogous in another sport, but there's something really special about going as hard as you can on a climb next to another person, and one of you just willing to hurt a little more, has a little more in the tank, marshaled your effort better, and you get away. And it the competition is decided in real time. You're not really tallying points. There are moments that are decisive, and I think in every racing sport, and I can get excited. I mean, I don't do pig races, cross country skiing. It doesn't matter. If there's a racing sport, I will be sucked in, and I'll be riveted, and I'll get emotionally invested, because it's just pure human effort. It's really cool.
Now that's not typical though. Most people, certainly Americans, they look at any racing sport and they say it's too long, it's too boring, nothing's happening. Do you think it's just that? Do you think that goes back to early exposure to it? Seeing the Tour de Trump come through upstate New York, having a brother who did a time trial or two, getting locked into it early. I mean, what is it that makes what? And I have that same component. I can look at it and go, something crazy is happening here when I'm watching Nordic skiing during the Olympics. Something I watch once every 4 years.
Yeah, I mean, it's not those long flat stages in the Tour. Let's be real, it's not exciting the whole time, but that moment exists somewhere. And what's cool about it's a nuanced thing, from the perspective of a rider, it's a real trip to do a bike race that occupies an entire workday. You go and do a 200K race and talk to somebody afterwards outside of the bike racing world, and they went to the gym and put in a half day at work, and made food and did laundry, and during the time that you were riding your bicycle, they could take a bath.
Yeah, right.
So no, nobody's attention span is that long. But I don't know. I'm kind of a narrow and deep guy. Like, I study jazz and classical guitar, and I read long books. I like stuff that requires focus. That I don't know. So. But that's, funnily enough, I know tons of people who race bikes and love the sport that are like really ADD. So I don't know, like there's definitely something about appreciating racing that is a common thread among different character types.
Does it even matter if cycling is never mainstream in America? Like, who cares, right?
Well, it doesn't matter to me, but I'm not trying to put together the budget to revive the USGP. And so that's the circle that I think needs to be squared. Is it's like, philosophically, like, we're all going to keep riding our bikes, like doing grassroots races or whatever. But what does it mean, like, for our best athletes to be competitive on the national stage? What kind of infrastructure do they need in order to have viable careers as professional athletes? And I think that, you know, the New England community, I mean, Jeremy Powers has leveraged his professional persona to tremendous effect, especially for somebody as young as he was when he started doing it, to really like leave a lasting mark on the sport and improve it for everybody. Obviously, Adam Meyerson has done a ton for a very long time. And I think, and there's a culture, I mean, there's a lot of institutional knowledge about how to do that in New England. And there's a culture of people choosing to make a difference in the sport. You guys, in terms of grassroots culture, I mean, like the grassroots scene around Nycross is as cool as I think anywhere else in the country that I've been. And then the Pacific Northwest, you have both like world-class athletes and you have hipster NASCAR, you know, huge participation.
Hipster NASCAR.
That's an old expression. That's like, that goes back a long time. I don't know who coined that phrase, but I mean, I don't know, like but it doesn't necessarily, like, in terms of what it means, like, you still, every year you have athletes on the world championship team who are having to pay their own way. Like, we're crowdfunding sending athletes to the world championships.
I mean, in a lot of ways, we're literally crowdfunding the sport, because you have, how much money do you think it costs to put on a UCI C2 weekend? Do you know what the like estimated budget is that USA Cycling hands out?
I haven't been involved in such a promotion in a few years. So, I mean, it used to be like doable on a shoestring for like 25 grand or so. I'm sure that's more than that now.
They say now your budget should be double that. They say you should have 50 for the weekend. That's a C2. So obviously a C1 or anything higher, you know, World Cup is obviously a lot more money.
Yeah, I was thinking single day, right? Yeah, so like 50 for a weekend. Yeah, that's about.
Yeah. So figure 50 for a weekend, and this year we had 43 events. So yeah, 25 times 43. What's that? That's basically it's a little more than $1 million, right?
That seems like not a lot of money for a professional sport.
No, exactly. So it's essentially the entire professional sports league in the United States, because they have the USA Cycling Pro CX calendar, which is just literally all of the UCI cycling races, right? Anything that's a UCI event is on the Pro CX calendar. So that's all your professional races. It's $1 million for the entire budget for the entire year, and the vast majority of that $1 million it comes from entry fees. It comes from the fact that how many people race at Gloucester each day? 500 people race each day, or 600 people race each day, right? 1,000 or more.
Well, and even in the elite fields, you know what's funny about cyclocross is that we have racing categories now, but you still essentially self-select into doing UCI races, because you can purchase an international license as a Cat 3, maybe even as a Cat 4. I know you can certainly do it as a Cat 3. So you don't have to actually be a national caliber rider in order to choose to participate in the national caliber races. Most people do, because it's not terribly rewarding to just be like, you know, completely outclassed by everybody. But I mean, if you look at in terms of what it means to be a professional athlete, like to race as your job, or to be like an amateur that's knocking on the door of that, like having money spent on your behalf so that you can try to pursue your trajectory as an athlete. You know, I don't know, in those races, you've got like a dozen riders that are fitting that description, and then 40 or 50 people who are paying their own way behind them, or getting, you know, bike shop sponsorship, or they're getting funding from their local club or whatever. Like, there's some amount of sponsorship, but, you know, buying your own international license is like $150. Like, tubular tires are super expensive. It's so most of what you see when you look at people lined up for a UCI race in this country is athlete funded, and
is amateur people who are paying their own way is what it boils down to, in quotes, pro level.
Yeah, and it's like a really narrow the top of the pyramid is really narrow. But I guess, I mean, again, like you look at there was a discussion a few years ago when the Belgian national championships was a race of like, I think it was 12 starters, and people were like, oh, that looks terrible. And a lot of people, including me, felt like it was a really good race. Like the race at the front was really exciting. And like, what difference does it make if there had been an extra 30 bodies a couple minutes down on the front riders? Like, it doesn't change anything.
Now contemplate this. Last year, I was just fanboying Stephen Hyde on cross results, right? And I noticed that his cross results score, it went up. It got worse based on his winning our national championships.
Yeah, I don't even the math. I'm not a math guy. I will say that. So,
if Colin listens to this and wants to write in and explain why that could happen, my understanding of it just means that the field.
If Colin listens this far to this, I just want to apologize to you.
Yeah, that's a good point, right? So here's the deal. Here's what I perceive that to mean. The field for our national championships was weaker than a large number of the races that Stephen had done in Europe before he came back to race the national championships. So when the algorithm applies it, and of course,
presumably that's true. But what does it mean? Like, but he's racing who? He's racing Kerry Werner. He's racing Jeremy Powell.
Right. So here's this is my analogy to your 12 Belgium. Is that race better? Why do we need to have that scrub zone of elite racers in the national championships or anywhere? That's you don't need that. It's a better race. I watched that. You watched the race this year. Did you watch it on TV? Or on your computer somewhere?
I watched it. I think I may have watched it on my phone, which is lame, but I did watch it.
If you're more than 5 spots back or 6 spots back, you didn't ever appear on the screen, right?
That's right. Yeah.
So to the viewer, as a potential professional sport presentation, right? I have to give USA Cycling immense credit. They have improved the long distance video coverage of national championships leaps and bounds.
Oh God, it's tremendous.
The idea that I can flip on my TV the day of nationals and just watch coverage with reasonably good excellent commentating, reasonably good camera angles, and be able to follow the race and feel like I'm really watching it and I know what's going on is a huge, huge leap of technology and improvement.
Yeah, no, tremendous. And in the commentating too, like, I mean, Tim Johnson has developed into like a really effective commentator, which is awesome because you need, like, if that's what you have in other sports, you have racers or athletes who are close enough competitively to the sport that they can effectively commentate, because you have to know you have to know riders' histories and riders' styles and riders, like, you have to know something about the drama and the narrative of the race and what's going on and relationships between teams and all this kind of stuff. Like, it's a complicated sport, and if you haven't accumulated some of that knowledge through being part of the race community yourself, it's hard to do it effectively. And I think having like Tim as a commentator is a real boon to the.
Makes a lot of sense.
I like when he nips at Brad Soner when Brad Soner doesn't quite get something right, and he'll kind of like underhandedly correct him. It's awesome.
It's awesome. Well, so Stephen Hyde won the national championships obviously this year again, but he won in 2017 as well, and then he went over to Europe. He raced Worlds, and then he raced a post-Worlds race, which is a heavy-duty race. It's not to suggest that it's not a big deal. I think it's the last bank trophy something race. Nathaniel, correct me if I'm wrong about any of this. And ultimately, he finished about 17th or 18th in that race, and his cross results score again improved. That was a more challenging race. And what I took out of that was that winning the national championships was easier for Stephen Hyde to do, and therefore cross results penalized him comparatively in a strength of field calculated score compared to finishing maybe just barely inside or maybe even barely outside the top 20 of the last trophy series race in Belgium. And
yeah, that's correct. I think right, and I think that there's a point. I think the short answer is that, like, the original reason that Colin built that algorithm was to come up with a more effective way to rank local racers than everybody having the race of like bandwidth, internet connection speed to register at midnight for races, or like lining up half an hour early for races. I don't.
Sure. And then ultimately to help with that first thing we were talking about self-selecting, that if you have a score of 300 or 200, you maybe have an idea of where you need to be at,
Exactly. I don't think we ought to live and die by it, particularly in international terms. If there's a question there, I suppose the question would be in your statement, the implicit question is like, would all of those people have finished in front of Hyde at the national championships? And And I think the answer is probably not, because you're dealing again with travel and food and sleep, and what does it mean to sleep in your own bed? Like all those guys in Belgium are doing races that are like between 1 and 2 hours away from home. They sleep at home, they wake up in the morning, pet their dog, and drive to the bike race.
Look at Vanderpool at 2 years in a row, just not showing up at World Championships.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that said, he still manages to finish second or third. I guess he was third this year, but I mean, yeah, that's, I guess, parsing the difference between like a world beating performance and a merely exceptional performance is another conversation. But no, I think that when our athletes are overseas, like, so the courses are harder. They're like, there's more. I've never raced over there myself, but talking to all my friends and teammates who have, it's like the courses are harder. The mud is muddier. The drops are steeper. I remember somebody, might have been Will Dugan or somebody years ago, saying like they ride down what we run up. Like the drops in those races like are what would be a run up for us. So they're going down on road bikes. They're going down stuff that wouldn't be out of place like in a legit mountain bike race. Like you want a slack head tube and a dropper post, and you're basically on a road bike. So the technical handling is a lot harder, and then the intensity is a lot harder. There are a lot more drugs. Like, I mean, I don't know, but there are definitely a lot more drugs. Like numbers, who knows numbers, but drugs are a thing. And in American cross, drugs aren't really a thing. Like, I mean, that I know, I'm sure somebody's doing something somewhere, but in terms of like elite American cross riders, like the general consensus among them, talking when nobody else is listening, as far as I know, is that they believe each other to be clean, which I think is pretty cool and probably less true in Europe. So,
well, there's that old adage that you can't really dope your turning.
You can't dope your turning, but Hyde doesn't need to dope his turning. Hyde can do what he wants to do on a bicycle. So I don't think it really comes down to that. I think like, I don't know what his physiological ceiling is. Like he's probably at an age and at the point of development as an athlete where he's getting close to it. But I mean, what is he able to do against the similar talent pool? It's like the same as Jeremy. Like you look at Jeremy, like what was it, a couple of years ago, the last season that Powers was like really dominant 2 or 3 years ago when he was in the group with like Kevin Powles and Vanderhaar across Vegas. And I think he got fourth, but he was like in the race for second until the last half a lap and he made a mistake. And like, he's not typically in the group with Vanderhaar and Powles in Belgium. They're not worse over here, but it's just, there's a series of weird factors and dynamics that have to do with being in your comfort zone and being on a familiar track and speaking your native language and eating the food you're used to eating and racing in the weather that you're used to racing in, and on and on and on, that makes it really difficult to compare. I mean, Jesus, like if there's a home field advantage in basketball, you know what I mean? Like if we can more or less accept that there's an advantage to playing in your own high school gymnasium instead of the other one across town that looks just like it, then I don't feel like it's too much of a stretch to be like, yeah, 4,000 miles in an ocean is kind of far away to be from your like peak performance conditions. So,
you know, I was going to attempt to debunk that because I thought I think I watch a fair amount of basketball, and I think I saw that it was a surprising skew that the home team actually has a slightly worse record in playoff games than the visiting team, like across the board in the history of the NBA.
That would be fascinating.
Which is fascinating, right? So I was going to say, and I did say that. So I said that I read that recently, that they were looking at that type of thing, and they figured out that there's essentially no statistical home field advantage. But then I thought to myself, I remember playing high school basketball for the great Averill Park High School basketball team, and traveling to our hated rivals in Watervliet, and literally having the hardest time in the world playing in that gym for no explainable reason other than that the locker room was like a dungeon and the gym was a small gym that was packed with people who would scream bad things at you the entire game.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly doesn't help, right? And I think, and there's also...
And it doesn't help. Right, exactly. So statistically at the level of the NBA, maybe there's no such thing as a real home field advantage in basketball, but absolutely.
Why? And this is the other problem with like statistics don't have feelings, but people do. And when you're far away from home, sometimes you get sad. I mean, it's pretty simple calculus. Like,
yeah, right.
You know, you've invested a ton of time and money and energy to like go and compete. And if it doesn't go well, or you get a flat tire, or you feel sick, like, you know, even the mightiest and most focused warrior athletes have moments of self-doubt and homesickness and depression and everything else. So there's so much that goes into like how somebody performs when they wake up in their own bed and race at home versus how they perform a world away with, television cameras on them. Like I don't know, man, the performance psychology around that stuff is super fascinating, but I don't think, so to answer that question, I don't think necessarily that it's easier for Steven to race Jeremy Powers and Tobin Ortenblad, head to head and win that race. I can't believe, based on nothing other than my own supposition as a human being, I can't believe that that's easier for him to do than to finish 20th. Because when you're finishing 20th, there's a certain point where the wind goes out of your sails, where like you're racing every corner, you're racing hard, but you didn't make the first group, you didn't make the second group. At a certain point, you've surrendered when you're finishing 20th, when you're as good as Hyde is, right? Like that's not necessarily his best effort on the day, or maybe it's his best effort, but like you sort of feel like, what was their awesomeness factor? You know what I mean? Like I remember having a conversation many, many years ago about making the front group talking with Al Donahue. And he's like, the thing is, you got to have a good first lap, because if you make the front group, the awesomeness factor will keep you there and you'll be able to suffer more. But if you miss the front group, then it's like, why am I hurting? I don't care. I'm going to be 12th. I'm going to go easy and I'll be 20th. And what's the difference?
That's true. That's 100% true.
So racing for the win versus racing, you know what I mean? There's all that weird, like, X factor around flow states and what it means to produce like a next level performance and like break through a barrier. And if you're 3 minutes down on the winners, you may still be next. You know what I mean? You may still be next to somebody amazing like Rob Peters, who's like a phenomenal world-class bike racer. And like, but I think after a while, if you're Stephen Hyde, like, oh my God, I'm in the group with Peters. Like the novelty, the bloom is off the rose a long time ago. And I mean, I wouldn't presume to know how hard Stephen is trying. It'd be interesting to ask him, like how hard are you racing the last lap of a race when you're in 20th in Belgium? But I got to think it's probably not as hard as the effort that he put in on the last lap to win nationals, right? Like that was some bike racing. I mean, that was beautiful. And technically and tactically too, that was, to digress a little bit, the thing that gave me joy as a fan was watching the beauty of the move that Hyde made to get past Powers before the run up. It was just a classic, like, I'm going here. You can fight me for it. We'll see. But I'm going here right now. And you do you. You know what I mean? And it's just like no harm, no foul. Right. Those guys are great friends. But it's hard to stay focused enough to do that, particularly when it's somebody that you like. And I was just really impressed with the fortitude and the focus. You're exhausted. You're 65. That was a long race. They're almost 70 minutes into that race by the time they got to the line. To be like, I'm going to make my best effort right now. It's going to be risky. I'm going to have to like shoulder check a friend out of the way to do it. And my eyes are going to stay forward and I'm going to keep my breathing under control while I do it. I mean, that's like, it's beautiful. But you know what? You watch it on TV and one guy rode past the other guy. You have no idea what happened. So like the best part of the sport is hard to recognize if you're not also a participant or a knowledgeable fan. It's not a home run. Like a home run is obvious, but like what it takes to make a last lap pass on an off-camber corner before a run up in a cyclocross race, like there's a level of nuance there that I think if people haven't grown up with the sport, it's just hard to translate to a viewing public. So I don't know.
That sums everything up right there. That's the beauty and the challenge of cyclocross when you look at the growth of it, because it requires participants to be able to appreciate what it is. You're absolutely right. You can't watch that on TV and know what really happened. But if you've done it before, the most exciting thing
Well, the Belgian fan, like if you've grown up watching it, if there's a cyclocross track in your hometown, and there is one in Winston-Salem now, by the way, there's a dedicated cyclocross track in downtown Winston-Salem put there by the cycling center. Yeah. So there's a USA Cycling Center in downtown Wisdom, National Cycling Center. They're trying to become like an Olympic training facility like Colorado Springs. They've got a bunch of irons in the fire. One of the things they did was repurpose some abandoned urban land and put in a purpose-built year-round cross track. So you can go there and practice. So you can see people go there and practice. So arguably 20 years from now, some kid in Winston-Salem, North Carolina has grown up watching what it means to be in pole position going into the run up on the last lap of a cross race. And he understands that the same way that we understand what it looks like to steal second base, right? Like you can grow up with that as a spectator if the sport's part of your culture, I guess, but we haven't in this country. So I think that the cigarette chomping, Belgian fans look at it and they know exactly what they saw because it's part of their culture, but we don't necessarily. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
And that goes back to one of the first things you said, which was to say that cycling has not arrived yet in this country, and there's no way around it. For it to be able to produce and effectuate national and international level riders, those participants are still super key. They're providing a huge portion of the funding. To some degree, they're literally crowdfunding these trips. They're paying with race entry fees. When you go and pay a $45 entry fee to race a lower level race at an international level race, most of that money is going into, nobody's getting rich running this. I don't think any of the promoters are taking any salary or any huge salary, certainly off of those big races. That money is all going into funding the existence of the race, which is giving the elite level talent the opportunity to race, which gives us the opportunity to learn who the best racers are and then send them over. But there's no way to square that circle exactly. You have to have the participants in order to have the culture to be able to fuel the racing. And that's it.
I guess that's why everybody, like, if you were reading around on Twitter and stuff when the CrossFit Games were going on, a lot of the kind of luminaries of the American cross scene felt like the cyclocross leg of the CrossFit Games was fundamentally a good thing because of the exposure. I couldn't get past feeling a little snarky about it myself, but I guess I just need to spend more time in therapy or something.
I felt snarky about it too.
But I mean, fundamentally, like, they're right. Like, if people see it and sort of know what it is, then, there's a way in. Like, you definitely, I'm sure you get some people who would sort of try it out based on that.
Well, that, and I suppose that there's your, I take back all of my snarkiness on that, because that's the avenue that gets it into the culture at large, which is the necessary part.
I watched my brother. So my brother is currently he's project managing the largest cryptocurrency mining operation in the world in Montana, but that's another story. But before he did that, he ran a production company that put on rock climbing competitions all around the country. So it was kind of like the USGP of rock climbing. He ran a company called NE2C Productions, and they put on bouldering competitions, the UBC Unified Bouldering Championship, because they were trying to create a title series that had meaning and was standardized throughout the sport. Rock climbing competition going back to the 80s was like historically boring, literally like watching paint dry. Like everything else, huge in Europe, unknown over here. Like lead climbing, route climbing competitions, like it's 100 feet long. It takes 20 minutes. Like, what am I looking at? There's an anorexic midget 80 feet over my head doing something, and then they fall. Like, who wants to look at that? And so there's all these different formats have been tried. And what my brother Pete came up with, and his partner Jason Danforth, was like, they added a laser light show. They added really good announcers to, in a very high energy and personable way, kind of pump up the crowd and also educate the crowd. They got incredibly good. There was a time when my brother was really one of the top route setters in the country in terms of setting routes for climbing competitions. And they would try to create like sports drama. Like they wanted there to be like a tie-break move on the last problem of the day that would come down to like a buzzer beater. One guy touches the hold, one guy sticks the hold, and that's the difference, right? And they got good enough at what they were doing that they were actually able to stage manage some of that. They were actually able to engineer dramatic moments in sports, and they grew their sport tremendously. And I watched my brother work for many, many years to try to get climbing into the Olympics. And ultimately he didn't succeed at that. And he moved on to doing other things and went and got an MBA. But now rock climbing is going to be in the Olympics. And like, and I mean, he's past it, I think, but I remember hearing this on the news one day and being like, I'll be damned. Like, I watched my brother spend like a decade of his life trying to carry that ball over the line, and ultimately he walked away. But I do kind of have to wonder, like, he definitely moved the needle in terms of viability of competition climbing in the United States. I mean, he didn't invent it and he didn't turn it into something completely new, but he did put on a rock climbing competition in Central Park in New York City that had like 30,000 people and like techno DJs and like national touring rock band. Like,
yeah, I remember when he did that.
You know that, and then there was the Nor'easter up in Burlington. We partnered with Meyerson, cross race bouldering competition, rock music festival thing. So there were like, it was interesting to watch that happen in others. But the reality there is like, there's not a whole lot of professional competition rock climbers in this country. There are very few of them, and in some ways it's analogous to bike racing. It's a very participatory lifestyle sport that some people train and excel at like world-class athletes, but not everybody. And you got to be really top of the food chain to be like making a living at it. And even still, like, will being an Olympic sport change it? I don't know. There's going to be a speed climbing competition. People are like, nah, that's not real climbing. Like, again, you know what I mean? You run into a lot of the stuff where it's like, is Olympic Taekwondo like a legit martial art? Like, this is a conversation that people, it's kind of like fencing with your body. Like, accuracy and speed matter more than power and ninja abilities. And there are people for whom, you know, that's a non-starter, right? But in terms of like a sanctioned worldwide sport with rules that everybody can play by, it makes a lot of sense. So these are the things that happen when you bring fringe sports into the mainstream and you try to standardize them for Olympic competition. Concessions are made. And so, like, ultimately, who knows, right? Like, if cyclocross were in the Olympics tomorrow, would it look like Gloucester? Or would it, you know what I'm saying? Like, would there be something analogous to like speed climbing?
Right. Well, and you know, that's kind of happened with Olympic mountain biking.
Yes, exactly. That's right.
Olympic mountain biking doesn't look like what mountain biking looks like when I go and do it, or when when we go to a mountain bike race. It doesn't look like either. It doesn't look like going for a group ride. Yeah. It doesn't look like going out and just riding single track by yourself. It doesn't look like probably any race I've ever done, and that's happening to World Cups too. You know, you see what the World Cups look like, and they don't really look like the type of riding that mountain bikers are doing. It's its own thing. You know.
Whoa. And there are people around here who have like deep religion about like machine cut, burned out turns, man. Just like we hate. I mean, I'm relatively new to the game, but like I like hand cut, old school single track. I like Pisgah. I like that kind of stuff. And Olympic style, IMBA style courses, while sustainable, are a bit of a snooze. And I think a lot of people feel that way. And so I guess with bikes, I mean, fundamentally, like, watching people go fast on bikes and race, like, it's still a racing sport. So it's still, but yeah, I mean, gosh, you watch a World Cup, like watching Nino ride laps by himself, like, it's not that entertaining, like, because the rock gardens aren't that rocky and the jumps aren't that jumpy and stuff is smooth and fast. And you're like, nah, it'd probably be fun to ride, but it doesn't really look amazing. And I love bikes and I love racing, and I can still watch a World Cup mountain bike race and be like, well, the downhill race will be exciting.
It's true.
Anyway, have we solved all the world's problems yet?
We may have solved all of them. Yeah. I don't know that I don't even know if there's a problem to solve at this point. I think we've solved them and then talked them to death to the point that there's no problems even.
Okay. Nathaniel, where can people find you on the internet?
Ward_Than Ward on Twitter, and Than Ward, just THANWARD on Instagram.
And Nathaniel, you have a coaching business. It's Inner Athlete, which people can find if they search Inner Athlete on Facebook, right?
Yes, sir. Yeah, I have an Inner Athlete Facebook page. Is their website to be coming soon? Reachable on social media. Enthusiastic about coaching the bike racers.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Amateur Hour CX. You can find Scott on Twitter at ScottBirdsey and on Instagram at Scotty_birds with a Z. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at MWalling. Eric pretends he's the show account, which you can follow at Amateur Hour CX on Twitter. If you found this enjoyable, please make sure to subscribe in your podcast player so you get our next episode. Thanks. See you then.